Julie Ann Genter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are two very different reasons for raising a tax. One might be just to raise revenue, which the government then uses to deliver public services. But there is another way of using tax, which is an economic instrument that encourages or better behaviour that we'd like to see more of. So the Green Party does support the use of economic instruments to reduce carbon emissions, to reduce pollution. That's a smart way of using tax to reflect the full external costs of what's going on, and that does or can do, it can raise revenue. And then we can use that revenue to put into smart alternatives that enable households and businesses to do more of the activities that they do with less pollution and less cost. And so the Green Party can support a moderate, steady increase in petrol excise duty, because what that signals to households and business is that actually it would be quite a good thing if they were using less petrol, because petrol is polluting. It's also very, very good to support the economy of New Zealand in a transition to being less reliant on fossil fuels. And it's really important to recognise. Now, unfortunately, the government isn't taking this smart approach to raising the petrol tax. What they are doing is increasing their revenue so they can spend more money on projects that increase the vehicle dependency of New Zealand and do not provide smart alternatives so that businesses and households can get around with less petrol. And it's really unfortunate that the government is not taking this opportunity to invest the increased revenue that they're going to get from petrol tax in the types of transport that have been historically underinvested in, and therefore New Zealanders haven't had the choice. I think a lot of the time the government confuses or conflates our high vehicle dependence with the preferences of New Zealanders. So it's true that most New Zealanders have to use a car to get most places. This isn't because that's what they want to do. It's the result, the direct result of government policy, successive government policy, that has not given New Zealanders the choices that they would like. And hey, that's happened all over the world in rich countries, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. We're all in this position. But most other countries have realized that we have this opportunity right now to get better economic outcomes, better health outcomes, better environmental outcomes, and reduce our vulnerability to spikes in the oil price by investing in smart alternatives as a priority. So that means in our towns and cities making people the priority rather than vehicles in our traffic engineering and planning and funding. And that means making it possible, putting a lot more money than what we're currently putting into making it safe for kids to walk and cycle to school, giving people the opportunity to live closer to where they work by reducing some of the barriers to intensification that currently exist in district council plans. So there's many opportunities to reduce regulation, reduce the amount of money that government's spending, and get outcomes that New Zealand households and businesses would actually prefer. Of course, the national government is entirely ideological about this. They don't have a balanced approach to transport spending. I love raising this graph. This is the new infrastructure spending in the transport budget for the next 3 years. It is not balanced. All of this purple is on a few expensive new state highways that will only carry 4% of daily vehicle trips. So most of the budget for new infrastructure is going on a very small percentage of vehicle trips. And freight on almost all of these routes is less than 10% of the vehicle trips. These roads already exist. We already have state highways. So duplicating an existing link is going to have very marginal benefits. You could improve the travel time and the safety on these routes for less than a quarter of the cost of the new roads. So it's a bit ridiculous to say that this is going to have any economic benefit at all for New Zealand as a whole. And what we have to consider is the opportunity cost. Of course, people in Hamilton and people living in Rodney in Wellington will have the perception, if they drive on the motorway, that it's a good thing, right? Because they're not paying for it directly. No, all New Zealanders are paying for it, and a small number of people are using it. So the opposition members don't understand the difference between direct pricing and indirect pricing and marginal costs and average costs. So what the petrol tax is an average cost pricing. And it means that the marginal cost of building the new road is not paid for by the people directly using that road. So of course they're going to say, oh yeah, this is a great thing. But the truth is, if they had to pay for it directly, they would not. They would not choose to. They would say, you know what, I'd rather spend my money doing something else, going about this another way. And that's what we've seen in Australia. That's why there's been this failure in the roading PPPs in Australia, is because, the traffic models overestimated the demand that people would have for a new tunnel under Brisbane or the airport link in Brisbane. The traffic models just overestimated demand. When people had to pay tolls, guess what? They weren't willing to pay the tolls. So it's unfortunate that the National Party isn't taking an economically rational approach to its infrastructure investment, because what's happening is they're spending a large amount of money on a few projects that are going to deliver very small benefits, if any benefits, and very little money is going to local roads, and almost no money is going on new public transport infrastructure, walking and cycling. And those are the areas that have been systematically underinvested in for the better part of a century. And they're very cost-effective. They're much more cost-effective. The truth is that there's nothing evil about cars, but they're a very expensive way to try and move a large number of people around urban areas. And the government members would like to portray my comments as being ideologically anti-car. They're not anti-car at all, because the best thing for people using the roads, particularly freight, is that more commuters have the opportunity to not take their car and not clog up the roads at peak time. And that is a more cost-effective use of our next dollar in transport infrastructure investment. So while it's fine for the member from Hamilton to say that people in Hamilton love this road and it's going to be good for the economy, the objective analysis does not stack up. The government announced this project before a business case had been undertaken, and I've read the business case, and it does not stack up. Actually, I was a consultant and I worked for Hamilton City Council as a transport planner and policy advisor. And so I was there, and I was in NZTA in 2008 after the new government was elected as a consultant working for the New Zealand Transport Agency, working on a report called Managing Transport Challenges as Oil Prices Rise. And the officials at NZTA were saying, what a disaster. The National Party has come in with these crazy motorways and the business cases don't stack up, and they want to move them right up the priority chain. And there is an opportunity cost, because that is billions of dollars not going on projects that would benefit more New Zealand households and more New Zealand businesses. You don't see the opportunity cost of the money that is not spent on smarter, better projects that would have a better outcome. Mr. Speaker, the national government is putting up the petrol tax and spending all of the money on projects that give New Zealanders no opportunity to avoid higher oil prices. And this is directly related to our current account deficit. There's been a lot of talk about the current account deficit and how the budget that was presented this week is actually forecasting a worsening of the current account deficit. And it is the current account deficit that reflects how much New Zealand is earning relative to how much it is spending on a national level. And it's really that tells us about the health of our economy. The government budget is only one tiny part of it. And even though the government budget can cobble together some optimistic surplus in a couple of years, if New Zealand overall is spending more money offshore and earning less by selling our goods overseas, then we're in a worse economic position, and it will be felt by New Zealand households and businesses. Our oil bill went from about $3.5 billion at the beginning of the decade to now $8 billion last year. We're importing the same amount of oil, but it's worth twice as much. So our current account deficit is worse because New Zealand households and businesses do not have the opportunity to get around in a more energy efficient way. And that's only going to get worse as time goes by. So it's right now that we critically need to be investing in those alternatives, because oil prices are not going down anytime in the future. Even if we drill it here, we're still going to pay the international price of oil, and even if we drill it here, we don't even use it here. It doesn't go in the tanks of our cars or trucks. It goes straight overseas because it's not that type of oil that we produce here in New Zealand. So we need to future-proof our transport system. We have the opportunity to future-proof our transport system, and the national government is not taking that opportunity, and it's going to be have dire economic consequences for the country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mike Sabin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.